Good morning, Wareham. There's Richmond burning. We're getting near the end of our Civil War. I'm in a library, so I can't scream out, "Good morning, Wareham." Sorry. All right, so I'm going to read a little bit of 28 because it's about the end of the war, and then we're going to read the end of the war, chapter 29. All right? All right, and that'll be it for the battles of the Civil War. Okay, so let's get a move on. The three of them, Grant, Lincoln, and Sherman, knew that Lee and his army would soon be starved out of Pittsburgh and the Confederate government starved out of Richmond. Would the rebels then surrender, or would they choose to fight on? The Confederate leaders did not consider the choice. Many of them feared they would be hanged as traitors if captured. Many had such a strong belief in the cause that they could not imagine surrendering. Of course they would fight. But they too knew the siege had worked. Lee planned to leave Petersburg, march south, join with the rebel army there, and continue the war. He thought he had a few weeks to get ready. That was before George Pickett fought a battle at Five Forks. It was a place where roads come together near a railroad line, a very strategic spot. Lee told Pickett he had to hold Five Forks. Food and supplies for Petersburg and Richmond came down those roads and went through Five Forks. Pickett, the same man who led the famous charge at Gettysburg, did what he was told. He won the battle, but when it was over, he went off to a shad bake, I don't know what that is, a few miles away. Shad is a delicious fish, and Pickett was hungry. While he was gone, the Yankees decided to fight back. They counterattacked. This time, they won. They captured the big prize, Five Forks. It was April Fool's Day, and when some Union soldiers were told of the victory, they couldn't believe the news. They thought they were being fooled. Now, there was no hope of the Confederates surviving the siege. The next day, Robert E. Lee told Jefferson Davis to leave Richmond. Then Lee and his army left Petersburg. Confederate troops decided to set fire to supplies in Richmond. They didn't want to leave anything for the Yankees. The flames soon spread. They actually set fire to where all the ammunition was, so they wouldn't get all that and all the supplies, and the big explosions, and that's what caused the fire. So ironically, and this does happen in war a lot, the Confederates set their own capital on fire by accident. Food that might have fed hungry Richmonders was destroyed. People's homes were lost in the flames. Documents and records that went back to the founding of Jamestown were among the things burned. When the fall of Richmond reached Washington, the citizens went wild with excitement. Cannons boomed, banners flew, people hugged and kissed and cried with happiness. After 4 years of worry and gloom, finally, the Confederate capital was captured. On April 4th, a tall man, wearing a tall black hat, I wonder who he is with a beard, right, had stepped off a small military boat at the foot of one of Richmond's 7 hills. He was escorted by 10 sailors, and his son, by the way. He had been told not to go to Richmond. It was dangerous. Too dangerous. He went anyway. That, of course, is Abe Lincoln. But the war wasn't won yet. Lincoln knew that. Grant knew that too. He knew he would have to capture or defeat Lee's army before it could end. But that tired, shoeless army was now racing west. The soldiers were hungry, really hungry. Some of them had gone days without any food at all. Their horses were half-starved, too. Luck wasn't with them. When they reached the railroad line where food was expected, they found trainloads of ammunition. You can't eat bullets. They marched on. Grant sent part of his army ahead. He was laying a trap. He wanted to surround Lee's army so there would be no way out. And finally he did that at a place called Appomattox Courthouse. Chapter 29, Mr. McLean's Parlor. Wilmer McLean didn't like to be hassled. So when he retired from business, he bought a comfortable farm with pleasant fields, woods, and a stream. He planned to live there quietly with his family. McLean's farm was in Virginia, but not far from Washington. It was near an important railroad junction. The stream that crossed the farm was called Bull Run. Do you think you know what happened on his farm? Well, you don't know all of it. Let's go back in time to 1861. In April, you remember, the war began when Confederates in Charleston, South Carolina fired their cannons at Fort Sumter. We're now in July of 1861. As yet, there have been no big battles. The two armies, North and South, are gathered near Manassas Junction. The Confederates are using Wilmer McLean's farm as a meeting place. One day, some Southern officers are about to have lunch with the McLeans when the Union artillery zooms a cannonball at the house. It goes straight through the roof and lands in a kettle of stew. The shell explodes, so does the kettle, and the stew is splattered all over the roof. That is just the beginning of the farmer McLean's troubles. Of the rooms. Because of its railroad lines, Manassas is a strategic spot. Neither army wants the other to control it. After the Battle of Bull Run, soldiers stay around, and a year later, another battle is fought there. Wilmer McLean has had enough. He decides to move someplace very quiet. He wants to be as far from the war as possible. So, he moves to a tiny, out-of-the-way village called Appomattox Courthouse. Maybe Wilmer McLean had magnets in his blood. He seemed to attract historic occasions. In 1865, the two armies, North and South, found themselves at Appomattox Courthouse. A Confederate officer was looking for a place to have an important meeting. Wilmer McLean showed him an empty building. It wouldn't do. So McLean took him to his comfortable red brick house. That turned out to be just fine. It was in Wilmer McLean's front parlor that Robert E. Lee officially surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant. In later years, McLean is supposed to have said, "The war began in my dining room and ended in my parlor." So that's true. It started with a cannonball into his kettle in his dining room, and then it ended in his parlor by the signature. On April 9th, 1865, Robert E. Lee, proud, erect, wearing his handsomest uniform, walked into Wilmer McLean's parlor. Strapped to his side was a gorgeous shining sword with a handle shaped like a lion's head. The sword was decorated with carvings and held in a fine leather scabbard. General Grant and his aides couldn't help looking at the beautiful sword. They all knew that, according to the rules of war, that defeated general must give his sword to the winner. General Lee knew that too, but he was not the kind of person who would bring an old sword to give away. He had brought his most precious sword. He had worn his best uniform. He held his head high. He knew he had fought as hard as he could. He had lost the war, fair and square, but he had not lost pride in himself and his men. Robert E. Lee's dignity and courage would be an example to his men when they returned to their homes. They didn't need to apologize for themselves. They had fought as well as men can fight. General Grant understood that. Later he described his feelings on that day. I felt sad at the downfall of a foe who had fought so long and so valiantly and had suffered so much for a cause, though that cause was, I believe, one of the worst for which people ever fought. And that cause would be slavery. But what should Grant do with Lee's sword? Keep it as a treasure to give his children and grandchildren? Turn it over to the country to put it in a museum? Ulysses S. Grant didn't do either of those things. He wrote out the official surrender terms. They were kinder than anyone had expected. The Southern soldiers could go home, and as long as they gave their promise not to fight against the country again, they would not be persecuted for treason. They must surrender their guns, but could take their horses. General Grant inserted a phrase in the document: the surrender did not include the sidearms of the officers. No one in the room said anything about it, but they knew. Lee's sword would stay strapped to his side. But there was something more important than a sword to remember about that ceremony in McLean's parlor. There were important words said there, and General Grant didn't say them, nor did General Lee. They came after the signing of the papers. When there were handshakes all around, General Lee was introduced to General Grant's staff. One of Grant's aides was copper-skinned Lieutenant Colonel Eli Parker. Lee looked at him for a moment and said, "I am glad to see a real American here." Parker, a Seneca Iroquois, replied firmly, "We are all Americans." Robert E. Lee, brave and heroic as he was, still didn't seem to understand why so many men and women had been willing to fight and sacrifice and die in this terrible war. We are all Americans. It was in those words. Eli Parker knew we weren't all the same. Our skins are different colors, our religions are different, our abilities are different, our backgrounds may be different. So what is it that makes us the same? What is it that makes us all Americans? An idea. We share an idea. That's what makes us alike. Other nations didn't begin with ideas. Most began with barons and kings. We started with a declaration that said all men are created equal. That new and powerful idea excited people all over the world, but our Constitution had not guaranteed that equality. The Civil War, terrible as it was, caused the Constitution to be changed for the better. 3 constitutional amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, would soon be passed. They would make sure that we are all Americans. They would give the nation a new birth of freedom. I believe the 13th had already passed, so it's a little inaccurate on the book. Yes, but that's the point. We are all equal, and we just got to keep fighting for that, right? Even today, we have to protest to make sure that everyone is treated equal. All right, so have a good one. I believe this is Friday, so have a good weekend. Bye.